so a couple things I want to talk to you guys about. Let's make sure that we are together on the plan for the rest of the semester. Next thing is that your fourth lecture test is going to be next Thursday, right? A week from Thursday, okay? And I want to talk about what it's going to cover. It's going to cover the rest of the vessels that we didn't have on the 3rd, right? Urinary system, lymphatic, which we will finish today, and then reproductive, okay? But please note that that means that you're going to be rushed for reproductive system, right? So how do you make sure you don't feel rushed? Well, you study it before you get here, right? So make sure, I know. So make sure that you read through your notes before you come on Thursday, and then over the weekend, even if I haven't lectured over the last of the reproductive system, get most of it out of the way so that we can just like confirm what you thought was true when you get here on Tuesday, because I know next week is going to be really rough for a lot of you guys because you have both a lab practical and a lecture test. So your lab practical for most of you is next week. And your lecture test is next week too. The only good part about it is there's a lot of overlap between what the lecture and the lab are testing about. And then other things that you need to know. Next Friday, not this Friday, but next Friday after your 4th test is the last time I have office hours for the semester. So last time for you guys to come look over your tests. And I will be in my office that day. I think I'm going to be there like 10 to 2. I'm still working on the time because I have to get somebody to pick up my kid, and then maybe I can be there a little later. So that is the time where you can come look over all of the rest of your tests. That's the last time you can make any test corrections. If you find something that was an erasure error or find something that was my error, that's the last time you can make those corrections, which we've been doing all semester long, by the way. The other thing is, let's talk about the whole final policy. Who has to take the final, who doesn't have to take the final, right? Okay. The only people who are eligible to not show up to the final are people who are making a 92.5% average or higher, including all 4 of your midterms and your lab grade. Okay? If you are not one of those people, you have to show up for the final. Okay? And don't not show up, because I will actually enter a 0 for your final grade if you do that. But the deal with the final, and this is, I'm going to give you guys a little encouragement, is that if you've taken all 4 of your midterms, your final cannot hurt you. Because if it ends up being your lowest grade, it gets dropped, right? If it ends up being higher than one of your midterms, it can help you, right? But it can't hurt you at the end of the semester. Now, I'm not saying it's easy. It's a comprehensive anatomy final. There's hardly any way to make it easy, right? Because there's just so much to remember. Do people make A's on it? Yeah, every semester a few people, a small handful of people make A's on it, but not very many. It's just a lot to remember. But people don't usually tank it if they study, right? It's not usually what happens. You usually do about the average of all 4 of your midterms if you take away bonus, because there's no bonus on it. It is all Scantron. It's at least 100 questions. I haven't written it yet, so I don't know how many. And there's no bonus on it, because I have to have them all graded like the next time. Your final's on Thursday, right?
Yes.
Okay, Thursday like 9:10 to 11:10. The only other thing is that please give your lab instructor gentle encouragement that includes the word please and maybe a cookie to get lab grades done as quickly as possible. There's no way that you're going to know whether you have to take the final if they haven't turned in their lab grades to me, right? You can know maybe that you don't have to take the final, and you can come take it anyway. It's not going to hurt you, right? So my objective, you guys have the Thursday final. So my objective will be to get all of your grades up, assuming that they give me the lab grades, but at least all 4 of your tests up by no later than Tuesday of finals week. And you guys are last, sorry, because I have few people who are taking their finals on Monday. And I have all 4 classes to grade. I may get them done before that, but I guarantee you it would be no later than Tuesday. Okay, so which means you're probably going to be studying a little bit anyway, and then if you end up having to take it, you're going to be studying intensely. So is everybody kind of clear on what's going to go on? Go ahead.
So next Thursday is the last test?
Yes, next Thursday, a week from Thursday.
Friday is the last office hours.
Last office hours on Friday.
Thursday.
Yeah, okay, so that's the other thing, is that I am going to do my dead level best to get the Scantrons graded for you between Thursday and Friday so that you can look over the Scantrons. You won't have your actual grade because I'll still be grading the short answers, but you'll have your approximate grade and you'll be able to look over the Scantrons. Go ahead.
What's the time and date of the final?
It is Thursday, May 5th.
Basically the last day.
May 5th. Yeah, at 9:10 to 11:10, and it's here. Everybody good? Okay. Seems like there's something else I'm supposed to tell you, but I don't know what it is, so we're going to move on. Okay. All right. Okay, so we're going to do lymphatic system today. And I'm going to go through it more quickly than you want me to, but I'm also going to test on it knowing that I went through it quickly. So the reason I want to do lymphatic system is because it's really important for people who are going into healthcare to at least be introduced to this body system. And that most of the time, you didn't ever even have it before. Like if you had anatomy in high school, it's not likely that you ever learned anything about the lymphatic system. So for a lot of us, it'll be your first introduction to the system. So before we get into the actual anatomy of the lymphatic system, let me tell you the big picture story of what it's about. Go ahead. Yeah, it's recording. Oh, it's not? Yeah, it is. It's recording. So you have this system. Show you just the basic anatomy of the lymphatic system. You have this body system that you probably haven't ever noticed in the cadaver. All of the vessels are really flat and really thin, so unless you're really investigating for them, you probably won't see them. So you have this body system, and it does two big things, okay? One of the big things is that, remember how I told you sort of consistently that fluid is leaking out of capillary beds into the tissue, right? Because capillaries are porous, right? At least to some degree porous. So fluid's going to be leaking out, and then I probably told you that 90% of it is pulled back up by osmosis, but what about the 10%? Because if you leaked 10% of your fluid out at every capillary bed, you're going to end up looking like the Michelin Man over a course of a couple hours, right? So how do you get that last 20% back? Well, what happens is you have this system of vessels that kind of runs parallel to your veins. And so this is called the lymphatic system. What it's going to do is it's going to suck that excess fluid back up by means I'll tell you in just a second. And then ultimately it's going to make its way all the way up, and it's going to dump it back into the subclavian veins. So it's the system that actually pulls excess tissue fluid back into the cardiovascular system. It's not very fast though, right? So if I leak something out, it's not going to be back in the cardiovascular system in minutes, probably not even in hours, because what happens is as it goes through, it also runs through the system of lymph nodes. So you are draining excess tissue fluid back into the cardiovascular system, and then in the process, you are also sending it through lymph nodes. So let's talk a little bit about lymph nodes and the function of the lymphatic system. Okay, so the lymphatic system has these vessels, which we'll talk about, and it's got lymph nodes, which you've seen before. It's also got some other parts to it. The other parts of the lymphatic system are bone marrow is part of the lymphatic system. The spleen is part of the lymphatic system. The thymus is part of the lymphatic system. The tonsils, and this stuff called MALT, mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue. But before we get into the specific anatomy, what the hell is the objective of the lymphatic system? Well, it's part of your immune system, and specifically, it's part of your SMART immune system. So whenever I encounter a pathogen, like influenza or like chickenpox or E. coli, whenever I encounter a pathogen, there's a two-tiered response. The first response is just brute defense, right? You see something weird, you whoop up on it with a macrophage, right? You're just like, hey, get out of here, you look weird. And then the next phase is to make sure that you remember the exposure and prepare for the next one. That is the SMART long-term immune system. Does that make sense to you? So the first part is called defense, and the second part is called immunity. Immunity is getting smarter about your responses and learning your enemy for the next time. And the lymphatic system is really important in that SMART immune system part. So I'm going to sort of tell you what it does in just a second. So basically, what's going to happen is in all of these locations that I've just talked about, or in most of them, in the spleen, in the tonsils, in the MALT, and in the lymph nodes, you have your SMART immune system. And it's redundant, right? Because with the immune system, you don't want a single place to be responsible for your immune system response. Ideally, what would happen is if I've got a whole bunch of like these lymphocytes, which are responsible for SMART immune system, I have them in series. So if I get exposed to a pathogen down here, I can launch an immune system response to it here. But what if I didn't catch it there? Well, I can launch an immune system response to it here. What if I didn't catch it there? Here, right? So I've got this redundant immune system that is doing its dead level best to make sure that any pathogens I actually learn from, respond to, and I'm ready for the next time. Okay, so that's a big picture understanding. Is that okay with you guys? Okay, so in addition to draining excess tissue fluid, I am also activating the smart immune system. It's called the lymphatic system. So let me give you a big picture understanding of what's going to go on there. So first, let's talk about the drainage for just a second. So I am supposed to drain that leaked fluid back from all of these locations, ultimately back into the subclavian veins. But what if I have a blockage in any of these locations? What if I have a blockage in the lymphatic vessels that keeps it from making it back up to the cardiovascular system? Well, I end up with what's called lymphedema, or this one is a specific type of lymphedema called elephantiasis. Now, you will encounter lymphedema. So, for instance, have you ever heard when a woman has a mastectomy because of breast cancer, a lot of times they will remove the lymphatic vessels and lymph nodes from this region? That's because they're a common route for metastasis in cancer, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But can you see that if I remove the lymphatic vessels, I'm going to have trouble with draining the excess tissue fluid from the left arm? Does that make sense? And so you can get this swelling associated because that 10% of tissue or 10% of fluid is leaking out and you're not effectively bringing it back in, right? So sometimes, for instance, they'll wear compression garments to keep the fluid moving back up. And then eventually your lymphatic system will actually heal itself. It's just going to take a little while. Well, this is elephantiasis. Elephantiasis is there is a mosquito or biting fly-borne worm. Okay, so if I am infected with this particular parasite and it goes through its life cycle in my bloodstream, then the eggs actually get into my bloodstream. Okay, so I have the eggs in my bloodstream, and then a mosquito bites me and then bites you, and you can end up with whole villages with elephantiasis, because what happens during the life cycle of this particular parasite is the larval life cycle likes to insist itself in your lymphatic vessels. And if it insists itself in your lymphatic vessels, it causes problems with drainage, right? So you can, for instance, from looking at this figure, right, see that it was probably encysted somewhere either around the knee or maybe even a little higher up. You can't really tell, right? That's called elephantiasis. It's not elephant man disease. That's a particular neurological developmental problem. But you can see it there. You can see it here. This is elephantiasis. And this one's pretty tragic. And this is elephantiasis of the testes, right? So is this curable? Yeah. It is, but you actually, interestingly, because these are animal parasites and you're an animal, most of the drugs that you would use to kill this parasite also are going to make you sick as hell. So you have to poison it out of your system, really. And it's going to make you really sick in the process. You're probably not going to die, but you're definitely not going to have the best day ever when this is happening. So they will generally have to treat like an entire area of people to make sure that elephantiasis doesn't continue getting transmitted from one person to the other. So you can basically see that this is a lymphatic vessel drainage issue. Okay, so we're going to come back to HIV and AIDS because the immune system functionality of the lymphatic system will teach you about HIV and AIDS. In addition, I don't just leak fluid out, I also leak large proteins out into the interstitial fluid, especially in my really porous capillaries. Those don't get picked up by osmosis, right? They don't get picked back up. So eventually those leaked proteins can make it back into the cardiovascular system. And then there's one other kind of interesting thing about the lymphatic system. So you guys know that most nutrients get absorbed from your digestive tract and then go through the hepatic portal system before you dump that blood back into circulation. But fats don't do that. Fascinatingly, fats get absorbed directly into your lymphatic system, not into your cardiovascular system, because there's these little lymphatic capillaries that are just behind your intestinal wall, and it goes straight into those. And that means something important. That means that fat is going to escape surveillance by the liver by circumventing the hepatic portal system. And so fat-soluble toxins are more likely to be life-threatening for that reason, because they don't go through the liver. They're also really hard to get rid of at the kidneys. The kidneys are really just good for getting rid of water-soluble toxins. So any kind of fat-soluble toxins and pathogens are really harder for the body to take care of. So funny thing about this that's not related to toxins is that if you eat a really, really fatty meal, like Thanksgiving with mashed potatoes and gravy and some pie, if you assess your lymphatic fluid immediately after, it's going to be like milky and opaque because it's got so much fat in it. And then if you give yourself about 20 minutes, your blood will also be milky and opaque because you have to take it all back up and then dump it into the subclavian veins, and then actually you're going to be able to see the fat in your bloodstream. Isn't that kind of gross? Kind of gross, but cool. I totally want to see it, but then I'm going to get grossed out by it. Okay, so I'm going to give you guys a quick story of the immune system. So I don't usually test on this particularly, like just a little bit, just like the basics. But I'm going to tell you enough that I think that you will kind of be a little better prepared for pathophysiology and immunology in the future. So I want to tell you a little bit about what is happening in your lymphatic system. So you have 5 types of white blood cells and then some subtypes. One of the types of white blood cells that you have is called a lymphocyte. And not surprisingly, the lymphocyte is really active in the lymphatic system. Does that make sense to you? Okay, so lymphocytes, there's multiple subtypes of lymphocytes, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about what's going to go on. So with these lymphocytes, the lymphatic system is going to be responsible for the smart part of your immune system, the part that learns about the enemy with each exposure and gets better at battling it with each exposure. Does that make sense? Okay, so let me introduce you to how this story goes. So what I want to imagine is that somebody just got exposed to chickenpox, okay? And it's the first exposure, to chickenpox. And let's say it's not a vaccinated exposure, you just got a kid who's having the first exposure to chickenpox. So I want to look at this particular picture at the top, okay? So this is, I know chickenpox is a virus, but let's just imagine it's actually a cell, so it'll go with the picture a little better. Okay, so every foreign pathogen has antigens on the surface, and an antigen is basically just an identifier that, identifies itself to itself. And of course, that antigen is going to be different than you, right? So it's going to meet this invader with a foreign flag on it. You guys with me? Okay, so when you encounter a foreign cell with an antigen, the recognizer of the foreign cells is a T cell or a T lymphocyte. Okay, so I'm going to come back to this T cell in just a second. So this is, you're meeting the foreign cell with the antigen. So there's a couple of things that are going to happen that are related to the immune system. So let's look at this figure and then we'll come back to the other one. Okay, so here's that same T cell that has the antigen. So I think of the antigens as basically this is the flag or the head of your enemy. And what has to happen with our body is that there has to be a general in charge of your entire immune system army. There's a general in charge. And the troops only take direction from the general. So here's the deal with this general right here, okay? This guy right here, the helper T lymphocyte, is the general of the army. And if you present that chickenpox antigen from the general, and I present it to you guys as the troops, then you guys are all going to attack anything that looks like that, right? What if some other Yahoo tells me that this is who to attack? You don't trust anybody but that one. So what happens with these guys is this helper T lymphocyte encountered the invader, and it whooped up on it, and then it put its head on a stick, right? And then it shows the head, the antigen, to the B cell, okay? This B cell is going to launch a massive smart immune system response, and it's going to remember exposure for the future, okay? Only if it was presented by the T cell, okay? So I want you to sort of put in your mind how important the T cell is as we start talking about this. Okay, so I want to show you what the B cell does. So this is a B lymphocyte, and the B lymphocyte will recognize the antigen only if it was presented by the T cell, okay? And the important thing that the B cell is going to do is not only whoop up on it, but remember it and get prepared for it next time. So the B lymphocyte or B cell is going to start going through cell division when the general tells it, okay? And during that process, it's going to make cells that make antibodies. Antibodies are proteins that will go out and whip up on anything with that antigen, but only that antigen. So this is a very specific response, okay? That means that if anything other than chickenpox goes by, no response whatsoever. So this is specific to chickenpox and specific to chickenpox for the rest of its life. So all of these antibodies are proteins that can whoop up on anything with that antigen, but then importantly, in addition, every exposure gets you a new memory B lymphocyte, and this memory B lymphocyte for the rest of its entire lineage is going to be devoted exclusively to chickenpox, right? Not going to do anything else. It is exclusive to chickenpox. The general told it once, you never need to be told twice if you're a B cell. And so this memory B lymphocyte is now going to go through another cell division. And with every single cell division, you make a whole bunch of antibodies, and then you remember better the next time. Does that make sense? So now I want to imagine that that kid got exposed to chickenpox, and instead of just having a really mild case of chickenpox, they had a 3-week case of chickenpox, right? How many of these divisions do you go through? Tons of these divisions, right? And so the next time, so let's say you get through this 3-week bout of chickenpox. How many chickenpox antibodies do you have circulating in your bloodstream? You have a bunch. How many memory B cells do you have that are specific to antibodies, specific to chickenpox do you have circulating? You've got a ton, exactly. And so what happens the next year when that same kid gets exposed to chickenpox? Yeah, so it kicks its butt before you actually maybe even have any symptoms of chickenpox. Does that make sense? Okay? Because you're so well prepared for that particular enemy that your immune system is primed for it. And so that's why people say something that's kind of a fallacy. They say, okay, if you get chickenpox, you can't get it before. It can't get it again. That's not necessarily true, but you can see why it's kind of statistically less likely. But way less likely if I had it really bad the first time, right? If I just had a couple of little spots from chickenpox, then there's no guarantee that I'm not going to get it again. Does that make sense? Okay, so this is what your B cells do for you. And then let's go back to our general for just a second. The B cells make antibodies and then remember for next exposure. But the general, the whole thing that had to start it was the helper T cell. And the helper T cell has other functions besides just that. So let's go back to our helper T cell. So this is the first exposure, right? This is the general. And the general, the helper T cell, in addition to doing what we know it does with B cells, it also does 2 other functions. It also stimulates macrophage activity. Macrophage are the big, dumb brutes of the immune system. They whoop up on anything that looks weird. They're really important in not just immunity, but defense. Okay? And then in addition, they also release these cells. These are called cytotoxic T cells, and cytotoxic T cells are a little more specific, but they also protect you from cancers and things that go wrong with your own cell. So if I have a viral infected cell, a cytotoxic T cell is the one that says, that looks kind of familiar, but I'm not sure that one's cool. And so they'll whoop up on that one, even though it was my cell. Same thing with cancerous cells. That looks weird. Let's whip up on that. So now let's go back to HIV for a second. HIV is tragic for the immune system because the cells that HIV infects and takes out is these guys. So do you see the problem here? You're taking out the generals of the immune system. And by doing that, you're taking out these brute defenses, the smart immune system preparation for next time, and you're also taking out your own resistance to cancer. So people with HIV do not die of HIV, they die of opportunistic infections and cancers that the rest of us don't get. And you can see why. So specifically, HIV actually gloms onto the same receptor that you're supposed to use for antigens. It's called the CD4 receptor, and it injects its particular DNA, and it's a retrovirus. And then every time that cell goes through cell division, it makes more of the virus and more of the virus, which infects more of your T cells. So as HIV progresses into age, your T cell count goes down, and then your immune system is compromised. and then it goes from HIV to actually acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. Does that make sense? Okay, so this is just a big picture kind of understanding of like the relationship between the lymphatic system and your immune system. And the immune system is not really like an anatomical body system. It's like a big picture physiological body system. Okay, so the specific immunity that we're talking about is preparation for each next exposure, and it becomes more effective with repeated exposures. And so this is what is happening in childhood. So when you have a baby, they get exposed to some pathogens, they get a little nose run, right? And then the next time, if they get exposed to a similar pathogen, they might be better able to battle it off. And so you're slowly building your immunity by each exposure to antigens. So I want to talk briefly about the vaccine controversy, which isn't a controversy, just so you know. Primarily what's going on with vaccinations is that people have a little bit of information, and they're going with a little bit of information to make a global decision. But from my perspective about scientific decision making, the facts should precede the opinion. You should make sure that you're well educated about this. So let's make sure that we all understand what's going on with vaccinations and how this is related to this whole idea. Okay, so if I want for a child to be less likely to actually succumb to a disease, either, you know, a life-threatening disease or even decreasing quality of life. So let's talk about like pertussis, whooping cough, right? Whooping cough, we have had vaccines for a very long time, and now whooping cough is coming back in Utah, in part because of the anti-vaccination movement. But I want to ask you about that time that you got polio. No, that didn't happen because we've been vaccinating for it for decades, right? So what happens with vaccinations, there's a couple of different ways to do it, but generally what happens is either you add the flag without the actual invader, right? You just add in the antigen, right? You inject the antigen, and injecting the antigen, if the helper T lymphocyte picks it up, it will start this immune system response, which will allow that child to have antibodies to, let's say, whooping cough or pertussis, right? And also to remember it so that the next time they get exposed to it, they are less likely to get it, right? There's no vaccination that is 100% effective because you are dealing with statistics and probability and also trying to predict that the antigen is going to look like that the next time you run into it. So you either use the antigen without the pathogen associated with it, or you use a killed pathogen, right? I killed off the bacteria or I killed off the virus, and then I injected the killed virus into my system. Well, just so you know, when you're going through this process, sometimes it makes you feel crappy, but it does not mean that you got whooping cough. It means that you had an immune system response, right? So if someone gets influenza vaccination and then they start feeling like crap, it doesn't mean you have the flu because there wasn't any live flu virus, but it means that your immune system sometimes actually takes you down a little bit during the process of preparing for the next exposure, right? So this is what happens here is they are giving small quantities of the antigen to get the benefit of actually this exposure. And so the other thing to talk about this is that we vaccinate not just because of individual choices, but because we actually are a social group of organisms. And with the social group of organisms, some of you can be vaccinated and some of you can't. It probably makes sense to you that sometimes people with HIV cannot have the same vaccinations as other people, right? Or it won't be effective. Sometimes people with autoimmune diseases cannot be vaccinated in the same way that other people can. And children can't be vaccinated against all things at all ages. So I want you to imagine what happens with what we call herd immunity. So what I'm depending on is that the vast majority of people that I encounter will be vaccinated against whooping cough. Because I'm going to my son's school to pick up my 9-year-old, and let's say I have a 6-month-old or 6-month-old who cannot be vaccinated yet. There's just certain vaccines that you don't have. And so I go to my son's school, and my son goes to a hippie school, so I'm sure you're not at all surprised that there are people who are anti-vaccine at the hippie school. So I bring my 6-month-old to pick up my son, and their special little snowflake Dakota, right, because there's like 12 Dakotas, their special little snowflake Dakota, they didn't vaccinate Dakota because they read one article on Joe Blow's webpage. Even though Dakota is 7 years old, that the vaccination causes autism. Just so you know, you're out of the window for autism, even if it did. And it doesn't. That was bad science that was published that people can't get over. So what happens is I pick up my child, and then Dakota actually gets exposed to my baby. And then my baby now has whooping cough, which is potentially deadly in infants. Because what we are depending on is that the vast majority of people who can vaccinate do vaccinate. And what's happening is the percentage of people who are vaccinating is going down. And yes, your special little snowflake might not need that vaccination, but all of those people who are immunosuppressed or can't be vaccinated actually do need the benefit. So what happens with people who are deciding not to vaccinate their children is that they're actually taking advantage of the herd immunity and not contributing to the herd immunity. And that's for people who can't vaccinate. The choice of not vaccinating is really for special circumstances. It's not just because that you have decided that that's not particularly. I personally think that kids who are not vaccinated should not be able to go to public school if there was no reason not to vaccinate them. I mean, nobody asks me because I'm in Utah and my voting machine isn't even hooked up, right? They're like, I know what she's gonna do. But anyway, that's the whole story related to that. You're not responsible for the editorial comments, but please do read something that actually had the scientific method associated with it before you make those kinds of decisions. And remember that actually we did have 2 babies at my hippie school who got pertussis this year. And you can't directly trace it back to Dakota, right? But you can say that there is 25% of the kids who are unvaccinated at that school, and you can see the impact on the community at large. Okay, so one other little thing, just to talk about, have you guys heard of immunoglobulin shots? They call them peanut butter shots, and usually people in Utah have heard of them because a lot of people have done missions to foreign places. So if I were going to Africa, to sub-Saharan Africa, and I've been living in Utah for most of my life, it's unlikely that I've been exposed to dengue fever. So in addition to being vaccinated against whatever, right, I might be exposed to, what about those first 2 weeks? How do I make sure that you are not really ill those first 2 weeks? Well, sometimes they actually just give you a shot of the antibodies, right? We know how to make the antibodies in the lab. So I vaccinate you, and then I give you a shot of the antibodies specific to dengue fever, and then you're less likely to get ill during the first few weeks, when your own immune system is also building up. Does that make sense? So those are immunoglobulin shots. They call them peanut butter shots because they're really thick and viscous, and they kind of hurt like hell going in. You've had one? I haven't had one. So anyway, and they're specific for specific regions of the world. Okay, so lymphatic system anatomy overview. So what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about all of these locations that you have the lymphatic system. So you have these B cells and T cells that can start this whole process in a bunch of places that seem reasonable. For instance, does it make sense to you that you're very likely to get exposed to respiratory and digestive pathogens in your pharynx, right? In your mouth, right? So the tonsils are big wads of B cells and T cells that are stuffed into the mucous membranes associated with the back of your respiratory and digestive system in your mouth. Those are called tonsils, okay? You also have big wads of it just below your digestive tract in the wall of the mucous membrane because you're going to do a lot of absorption and have potential exposure. When it's stuck in the wall of your digestive tract, it's called MALT, mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue. Then your spleen is more, and your thymus has a function as well. All of the lymphocytes ultimately came from your red bone marrow. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go look at what the fluid is in the lymphatic system and then the organs. Then we're going to look at how this sort of redundant nature of the lymphatic system protects you. So first, we are going to have all of these vessels, and these are lymphatic vessels. What do they have in them? They have a fluid in them that is called lymph, and lymph is really like blood plasma, because, right, you pushed it out, right? Or interstitial fluid, plus a whole bunch of antibodies, right? And a whole bunch of white blood cells. Does that make sense? So what's going to happen is when I push that fluid out, I'm going to have to pull it back in. And when I pull it back in, then I'm going to run it through lymph nodes and maybe make some antibodies as I go through. Okay, so The fluid is called lymph, and it contains less protein than blood plasma, no red blood cells, no platelets, but usually a whole bunch of white blood cells and a whole bunch of antibodies. Okay, so where does it originate? So you guys know what blood capillaries look like. Where is it? Okay, so around your blood capillaries, which are microscopic, so you really don't see them, right? You have lymph capillaries. But blood capillaries are connected in a circle, right? Ultimately, they're going to be connected to arterioles and venules. Lymph capillaries are blind end. So do you see what I mean by blind end? Okay. So if I took one of those lymph capillaries and blew it up, it's going to look like this. So it's just an in door, right? And it's not out. It's not going to circulate anywhere from there. So what's going to happen is you have these blind end microscopic lymph capillaries that are sort of nestled within your blood capillaries. And these all have one-way valves in them. And the one-way valves allow them to pick up damn near anything. They're total generalists. They don't care what they pick up. They pick up big proteins. They pick up fluid. They pick up whole cells, including pathogens, E. coli, whooping cough, viruses. They pick up anything that is actually in the tissue, right? Now, when they pick it up, what they're actually going to do is to start gathering it up, gather up the fluid, and then as they gather it up, they're going to dump into actual lymphatic vessels, which you can see with the naked eye, right? They start out as microscopic lymph capillaries, and then they end up dumping into these lymphatic vessels. So I want you to think about the hand for just a second. So let's assume that, of course, you have blood capillaries at the ends of your fingers, which is why you can do a finger prick, right? You also have lymph capillaries. And those lymph capillaries drain the excess fluid, and ultimately the fluid is going from there, and all of it is headed to dump back into my subclavian veins, right? It's all headed, and it kind of runs parallel to the venous system. Does that make sense? And so if you look at it and you think it's all headed to the subclavian vein, you can tell which direction fluid should be moving through any of the lymphatic vessels, right? Okay, so it's moving up, and in the head, of course, it's moving down. But as it's moving through, you're going to sort of shunt it through a series of lymph nodes. At each of those lymph nodes, there are B cells and T cells. So if I picked up anything funky, I might launch an immune system response to it at the first one, or the third one, or the 31st one, right? And ultimately what I am doing is trying to make sure that I have a lot of check mechanisms to make sure that I am actually responding to anything that I get exposed to. Okay, what? Yeah, checkpoints, exactly. And then it's completely got so much redundancy in the system that you'll see why you're still alive. Okay, so I have these lymphatic capillaries, and those are microscopic. The ones that are specific behind the intestine, those little capillaries, are called lacteals, and those are the ones that are for fat absorption. They do other stuff too, but okay. So then when I unite, I'm going to form one of these lymphatic vessels. So I want to look at one of these lymphatic vessels. Those are visible with the naked eye, as I mentioned. You probably haven't seen them because you have to really dig around for them. But there is one cadaver on the Jordan campus that has a huge enlarged spleen. Yeah, and if you have one of the lab aides look for you, you can find the lymphatic vessels on him because his lymphatic system is so overactivated. Okay, so I'm going to take one of these vessels and I'm going to look at what's inside of one of the lymphatic vessels. This is not a capillary. This is a vessel that I can see with the naked eye. It is like a vein, only it's even thinner walled, so they collapse really easily, right? And it's got way more valves in it. Why does it need way more valves than even a vein? Super low pressure. It's not hooked up to your cardiovascular system really at all directly, certainly not to the arterial end of your cardiovascular system. So there's super low pressure. If you find one in a cadaver, run your fingers along it. It's super lumpy because there's a series of valves in it. Does that make sense? So what moves the fluid through these things? They're not hooked up to a pump. It's really just skeletal muscle contraction and the respiratory pump activity, right? Does that make sense? So you have better flow of all fluids, not just blood, when you are active, which actually means, although it's a very slight increase, you actually have a more active immune system when you are physically active. It's a minor change, but yeah. So The lymphatic vessels are generally going to follow the path of veins back toward the heart. Ultimately, they dump into the subclavian veins. But one more thing, since the lymphatic vessels are really not at all specific about what they pick up, now you can sort of have an appreciation for why the lymphatic system is a very common route of metastasis in cancer. So, for instance, if you have breast cancer, right? One of the characteristics of a cancer cell is that they don't stay put. They are really likely to pull off of the tissue, even if it was like a connective tissue that generally stays put. Cancer cells are mobile. They will pull off of the tissue and then they'll go into whatever tissue is around it. And then the lymphatic vessel, which really isn't very smart, it's just doing this thing, right? The lymphatic vessel will pick up that cancerous cell. And cancers, not only do they come loose really easily, they actually insist in other tissue and start causing cancers in other tissues. So the lymphatic system is the most common route of metastasis in cancer. So how do I have a breast cancer that ends up a brain cancer? That's how I have it. The lymphatic system circulates that stuff around. So generally, whenever you have a cancer, a regional cancer, they're going to remove the lymphatic vessels around that area and the lymph nodes around that area. That make sense? Okay, so common route of metastasis in cancer. Okay, so now there's this really weird drainage pattern. So you look at this and you're like, okay, it looks relatively symmetrical. It looks like maybe the whole entire right side of the body would dump into the right subclavian vein, and the left side would dump into the left. But no, we have this super weird drainage pattern that doesn't make a damn bit of sense. It's just like an evolutionary anomaly. Okay, so please note this big vessel right here. It's a big open like sinus. It's called the Cisterna Chyli. And the Cisterna Chyli is kind of gathering everything up from down here. And then I've got this big vessel right there. Okay, so if I pull all of that off, I look and I can see, do you see this big? That's the Cisterna Chyli. Okay, that, if you follow that up, it's going to form this big duct called the Thoracic Duct. And then the Thoracic Duct is going to dump into the left subclavian vein. So conceptually, what does that mean? That means that the blood that is actually in the superior vena cava will be different than the blood that's in the inferior vena cava. Do you see? It's going to have more antibodies and more white blood cells in it, right? So that just gives you sort of a big picture understanding of what's going on here. The blood will be different, right? Okay, so that's all going to dump into there. But then the right side just has this little vessel that dumps into the right subclavian vein. So look at the drainage pattern. It's totally weird. So the entire left side of the body and everything below the ribs dumps into that big thoracic duct and ultimately into the left subclavian. And the only thing that the right actually drains is the right side of the head, the right arm, and the right side of the chest. So it's completely not parallel at all. It's just like weird drainage pattern. So what you are seeing is right here. So the entire left side of the body goes gathered up into here, follows the thoracic duct up, and the right side of the body follows this little bitty vessel and dumps right there. Okay, so it's a weird drainage pattern. Go ahead.
So none of it goes into the inferior vena.
It all goes into the two subclavian veins and it'll end up in the superior vena cava. So the blood is totally different, which is kind of interesting to me, superior and inferior vena cava blood. Okay. So that's just the basic anatomy of that stuff. So we already talked about what the flow is. Okay, so now I want to put together the story that we told about the B cells and the T cells and the smart part of your immune system. I want to put it back together with that anatomy. So what I'm going to answer is the question of where is this happening, right? And where is this happening? Related to those anatomical structures that we just talked about. Does that make sense? Okay, so where are these things happening? They're happening in a bunch of places in the body, but pretty much what you're going to have is, remember, the T cells are the generals, right? And the B cells are the soldiers. So what I want you to see is that everywhere you have lymphatic tissue, you're going to end up with these repetitive structures. So let me show them to you in several different figures, and then you will see that whenever I have lymphatic tissue, I'm going to use the same basic building blocks and then arrange it a little differently. So look here. Okay, so do you see this light center and dark edge, right? Do you see it also here, light center and dark edge? That's called a lymph follicle. And the dark edge is the generals, the T cells, and the light center is the soldiers, the B cells, okay? And so I can put different arrangements of that in different locations. So if I take a whole bunch of those lymph follicles or nodules and stick them just behind the mucous membranes in my throat, big wads of them, I call them tonsils. If I stick them just under the digestive system mucous membrane, I call it MALT, mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue. If I stick it in a lymph node, do you see the same arrangement? Dark outside, light inside. If I stick it in a lymph node and wrap it with connective tissue, then it's a lymph node, and you can see it right there. This is a lymph node. Do you see? If I stick it in the spleen, do you see the spleen? So basically what I have is repeating units of this B cell T cell arrangement, right? And depending on where I put it, is either going to monitor what comes into the respiratory tract or the digestive tract, or what's going through the bloodstream, okay? But regardless, it's all this same repeating unit, which is called a lymph follicle or nodule. It's this oval cluster of lymphatic cells, and it has a pale center where the B cells are and a darker outside where the T cells are. So let's go and look at it with reference to tonsils. Okay, so these are your tonsils. You have the tonsils that are at the very back of your throat, which is what people are usually referring to when they call them tonsils. Those are called the palatine tonsils. Then you've got some that are at the bottom, at the back of your tongue, and those are called the lingual tonsils. And you've got these that are at the back of your nasopharynx. Those are called the pharyngeal tonsils, or sometimes adenoids. Do you know those terms? Okay, so what all of those are is lumpy chunks of lymphatic tissue. All of those things, this is a tonsil, that's what you're seeing right there. Lumpy chunks of those that are just associated back there. And what they are is basically monitoring sites to figure out what you snorted in or ate, right? And if you run into a pathogen, what happens is these will start to launch an immune system response. And during the immune system response, there will be big boatloads of cell division that go on there that sometimes can make them feel swollen, right? And sometimes even painful. Is that okay? So those are your tonsils. So then you don't feel these being swollen, but there are the same kinds of ideas, same kinds of ideas. This is just below your small intestine. So just under your small intestine, you have little blobs of B cells and T cells. And if you get exposed to digestive pathogens, those will launch an immune system response. Good. And then a couple of other places. So the lymph node. So let's talk about our friend the lymph node. So do you see the B cells and T cells that you've got here? So I want you to imagine that this lymph node is one of these guys right here. Okay, I want you to imagine that it is the lymph nodes that are the cervical lymph nodes or submandibular lymph nodes are right here. Because how many of you guys have felt those when they got swollen, if you ever got sick? Okay, so what happens with those, if you've got big ones, because lymph nodes are really variable in their size, or if they're superficial, really close to the surface, then sometimes you can feel them when you get sick. So what's going to happen is, I want you to imagine you've got these submandibular or cervical lymph nodes, and then we'll look at it up close to see what's going to happen there. So your lymph node has in tubes, because I gathered fluid from the head, and it's got out tubes. So not surprisingly, these are called afferent vessels, and this is the efferent vessel. And so what happens to that lymph as you send it through a node? Well, what happens is you send it by the general and the troops, right? And if it runs into any antigens, you're going to launch an immune system response. That means you're going to start making B cells, antibodies, T cells, macrophages, all of that's going to go on. So the lymph that comes out this side, if it got exposed to an antigen, would be different than the lymph that went in, right? And so what happens is you go from the outside, which is the capsule, then you go through the cortex and then the medulla, and then you go out this lymphatic hilus or hilum, okay? And so you don't just go through one, you go through a series of them, right? And you might be going through them there as well. Does that make sense? So this is how a lymph node works. And when the lymph nodes are swollen, It's called Lymph Adenopathy, which is a really long word, but really what it means is your swollen lymph nodes. Is that bad? No, not really. It means your immune system is functional and active and you got exposed to a pathogen. However, sometimes it is kind of tender and painful. So if you go to the doctor and you've got strep throat and they feel your lymph nodes, they're like, is this painful? Or is this sore? Yes is a fine answer. Usually swollen lymph nodes will be sore. Cancerous lymph nodes, however, are not sore. So sometimes that's one of the things that they're assessing. So the other thing is that when they're swollen like that, they have a funny name. They're called buboes. And a swollen lymph node is called a bubo, and which is where the name bubonic plague came from. So one of the first indications that you might be infected with the plague was swollen lymph nodes. So in that situation, if they ask you if those things are swollen, you say, hell no, because you're about to get thrown out, right? So now bubonic plague is not really a big deal. It's just a bacterial pathogen, and we've got effective antibiotics, so you don't really hear of anybody like getting the plague or dying of the plague or anything. So that's sort of the lymph node function. So you guys understand that? And then MALT does the same thing, mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue, only in a different location, and this is MALT. And tonsils do the same thing, only at the back of your throat, so that's tonsils. So you got this repeating unit right there. And the appendix, by the way, it's not on your figures, but the appendix is lymphatic tissue as well. And it actually projects from the cecum of the large intestine, and in other organisms, not humans, it's super active in the immune system function. But in us, we don't really need it. We've got so much other redundancy with our immune system function that we can live without our appendix. As a matter of fact, since the appendix is associated with the large intestine, and it's kind of just this little projecting structure, sometimes it gets like pre-poop in it, right? And when that happens, you can have appendicitis, and then it can lice in your system. So sometimes they just take the damn thing out. Does anybody else not have an appendix? I don't have one. There's just a couple of us. They don't do it as frequently as they used to. They also don't remove your tonsils. So let's talk about tonsillectomy for just a second. When they remove your tonsils, usually the ones that they're talking about removing is the palatine tonsils. Sometimes with repeated activation of the immune system back there, they can become swollen, have a sort of a lumpy structure on the surface that makes them actually more likely to house recurring infections. For most of us, it's good to have them back there, but if you have a kid who gets strep throat 6 times in a year, sometimes they will start considering taking those out. So those are your tonsils. Adenoids, some people have their adenoids removed as well if they have recurring respiratory infections, but they don't remove them as often as they used to. When I was a kid, a lot of people got their tonsils out, but now kids don't do it. As a matter of fact, the kid next door to us, he's one of those kids who gets strep throat like 6 times a year, and my kid never does. So he's 11 now, and they finally just removed his tonsils last year because they want you to get it X number of times in a season before they're going to remove them. Because although it's not ideal, it would be nice to be able to keep these, right? These are a protective mechanism, unless they're causing more harm than good. Go ahead. They do cause snoring when they're swelled, and these cause snoring too. So if you have repeated infections, one of the guys in the last class told us that he had repeating infections like 20, 25 times when he was a kid, and it actually had obstructed the scar tissue, obstructed his breathing enough that he had sleep apnea. He got him removed? Yeah. He had sleep apnea, and his heart was actually stopping because of his sleep apnea. So they went and took them all out of there. Okay, so we got our lymph node function, we got our afferent and efferent vessels, we got our bubonic plague, and we did our lymph nodes. The primary locations of the lymph nodes are just kind of what you would expect to call them. So let me briefly show you where they are. You've got the submandibular and the cervical lymph nodes. You've got the axillary lymph nodes, and you've got the inguinal lymph nodes. And you've got the others are just scattered around. That's not the only locations, but it's where you have the biggest locations of them. Okay, and then the last organ to talk about, no, almost the last 2 organs to talk about are the spleen and the thymus. Okay, so what the hell does the spleen do? What does it have to do with this story? Well, we have talked about all of these structures sort of monitoring the air, monitoring what's going through your digestive tract, and monitoring the lymphatic fluid. But we haven't taught you a structure that monitors the blood. So what the spleen does is it does the same thing with the blood that a lymph node does with lymph. So you guys remember where your spleen is, right? Left hypochondriac region. And if you take a chunk of the spleen and look at it, you're going to see a structure that looks pretty familiar to you, right? Dark on the outside, light on the inside. So these are the generals and this is the army. Only this time, instead of monitoring lymph, you are going to monitor blood. Okay, so you're going to send blood through the spleen. And as it goes through, if there are any pathogens in the bloodstream, you can launch an immune system response to it. This means that the blood that is coming in the splenic artery is different than the blood that's going back out the splenic vein, right? The blood that's going back out the splenic vein might have more antibodies and more white blood cells in it, right? And now, to put this back together and to make it into one story, where is that blood headed from the splenic vein? Yeah, hepatic portal system. And remember, you just absorbed potential toxins and pathogens, right? So now what I'm doing is, as I am sending in blood that is potentially toxic or has things that I have encountered before, I'm also sending in antibodies and white blood cells into this common capillary bed. So you're sending in the troops at the same time as you might be exposed to the enemy, right? And that's why the blood in the splenic vein ends up in the hepatic portal system. That makes sense? So that's sort of the big picture understanding of what the spleen does. The spleen does the same thing to blood as lymph nodes do to lymph, right? Okay. The spleen has other functions as well, and it's got some cords and stuff in it. We're not particularly concerned about the details for right now. The spleen also gets rid of old red blood cells and platelets and all of that kind of stuff. Okay, so last thing is just the thymus gland, the gland that you may or may not have ever thought about the functionality of before. The thymus gland sits just behind the trachea. It sits kind of on the surface of the heart, on top of those great vessels, right on the top of the heart. And have you guys seen the thymus in any of the cadavers? Okay, it's not going to be very big because it actually degenerates in size as you age, and all of our youngest cadaver is 67. So you're not going to see them. So I want to talk to you about the function of the thymus. So I told you that all of your lymphocytes are made in the bone marrow. If they are made in the bone marrow and mature there, they would be called B lymphocytes, B for bone. If they are made in the bone marrow but mature in the thymus, they're called T lymphocytes, T for thymus. So the thymus is the site of the immune system maturation. For all practical purposes, this is where the generals are trained, right here, okay? And so they continue their maturation process. So the thymus is really, really active in children, and it's also really, really big in children. And so what's happening is you're getting all of those generals trained and sending them out, and getting all of the generals trained and sending them out, okay? But as you age, the thymus activity becomes less and less important because you're already populated with generals, right? So the thymus starts to degenerate in size, and then as you age, it's just kind of like a strip of, it looks like fat on top of the heart when you're really elderly. So fairly large in children. It makes a hormone called thymosin that helps to mature the rest of your immune system. So there is a specific disorder in which a kid either doesn't have a thymus or doesn't have a functional thymus, and it causes massive immune system problems. I mean, you can imagine if you never had any generals, right? Then your entire immune system and also your macrophages and your defenses against cancer are all going to be taken out. That's called SCID, Severe Combined Immunodeficiency Disease, the bubble boy disease, right? So if your thymus isn't functional or isn't present, then you are going to be susceptible to just damn near everything that you could possibly imagine getting. Does that make sense? So that's the functionality of the thymus. Okay, so we're going to stop there for today. Oh, these are inflamed tonsils. Gross, huh? Go ahead. You do? What floor do you work on?
Cancer transplant. We give them bone marrow transplant. Why does it
Why does bone marrow transplants help? Because what you're doing is you're taking my white blood cells. Yours are not functional. My white blood cells are already functional. Then they can't what? Their thymus doesn't work, but if I give you some from a person whose thymus does work, then you are going to be okay, especially if it's an adult, right? The adult, you've already like activated everything. The generals already know what to do. So that's why it can help them. But they have to have them repeatedly, don't they? Really? Sometimes it works just once? What, where do you work again?